On Mother's Day in my own backyard in Midran in front of 35 guests, my son Cabello stood up. He tapped his glass of champagne once with a fork, and the small sound cut cleanly through the chatter. Even a Makle stopped running and stood very still, bouquet in both hands. I smiled. For 1/2 of 1 second, I believed I knew what was coming. Cabello looked straight at me, not at the crowd, first, straight at me, his mother standing behind 35 folding chairs I had paid for. I wish you'd never been my mom. The words came out clean, not slurred, not shouted, not the accidental cruelty of one glass too many. He said it the way you'd read a line off a card. Then he laughed, short, sharp, and turned to the table like he'd told a joke everyone was in on. Come on. Everyone here thinks it too, right? Nobody laughed with him. The silence that followed had weight. I heard the wind moving through the acacia trees along the back fence. I heard very faintly the soft hiss of the chafing dish burners still going under trays no one was eating from anymore. A Makle stood frozen near the patio. The paper bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the grass petal side down. Aunt Nomsa's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I did not cry. I did not ask him to explain himself. Something in me, some old buried part of myself went very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Looking back, I understand now that Cabello wasn't only cruel in that moment he was performing. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that my quiet giving was weakness, not love, and that humiliating me publicly would finally prove to everyone, including himself, that he had outgrown needing me. Underneath the arrogance was a boy terrified of being seen as dependent on his mother forever. He mistook my patience for something to escape, not something to be grateful for. I stood up slowly. I untied the pale pink shawl one of my staff had draped over my shoulders that morning as a gift. I folded it once and laid it over the back of my chair. Then I took out the keys to my Mercedes GLE black, paid for entirely with money I had earned, registered entirely in my name. The one thing in 6 years I had bought purely for myself. I walked past my son without looking at him. I got in the car. I drove out of my own backyard, past 35 stunned guests, past a granddaughter standing over a fallen bouquet. I merged onto the N1 toward Four Ways, tail lights blurring red ahead of me. My hands were steady on the wheel. That surprised me. My phone buzzed against the passenger seat. I didn't pick it up right away. Instead, I opened WhatsApp and scrolled backward, not to his most recent messages, but further, the way you press on a bruise just to check if it still hurts. 4 years back, I found it. A message from Cabello sent on a random Tuesday for no particular reason. Ma, one day, this car will be mine anyway. Love you. I remembered reading it the first time. I remembered smiling, sending back a laughing emoji, believing completely it was affection. Sitting in the car now, that same message did not read like affection anymore. It read like a timestamp, something that had been quietly, patiently waiting. The phone rang again. I looked at the screen. Johannesburg Metro Police. I sat at a red light, the phone buzzing in my palm, my own breath, the loudest sound in the car. And for the first time since I'd walked past my son without a word, I let myself ask the question that would define everything after. What else had he been preparing for long before today? The light turned green. I took one long, slow breath, the kind you take right before stepping into cold water, and finally answered the call. My name is Tandeka Mukwena. I am 41 years old, and for most of my life, I believed one simple thing, that love given freely and without conditions always finds its way back to you. I believed that if you fed a family long enough, stood in the rain for them long enough, gave until your hands were empty, eventually someone would look at you and say, thank you. I don't believe that anymore. Not after Mother's Day. Before I tell you what happens with that call, and it does not end the way you'd expect, I need you to understand where I was standing that afternoon, because where I was standing matters. It tells you everything about what was about to be taken from me and what I had already quietly given away without even realizing it. This is the kind of drama family stories rarely tell out loud because the people living it usually decide it's easier to just keep smiling. If you believe no love should cost a woman her dignity, stay until the end, because what happened next didn't just break my heart. It cracked open 6 years of secrets I never knew I was carrying. Let me back up. It was a Sunday in early May, the kind of soft Johannesburg afternoon where the light turns gold around 4 o'clock and the jacaranda trees along the fence line still held on to a few stubborn purple blossoms, even though their season had technically ended weeks before. I remember that detail because I'd stood under one of those trees that same morning, coffee in hand, thinking how strange it was that some things bloom long after they're supposed to stop. My backyard was full. White folding chairs, silver chafing dishes, a small arch of white and gold flowers near the patio, because it was Mother's Day, and because foolishly, maybe, I wanted it to feel like a celebration worth remembering. I paid for every bit of it myself, pulling from Isisekelo Events, the company I had built from a card table and a borrowed tent 17 years ago, into something with a real staff and a real name in Johannesburg's events industry. 35 guests, my mother's sister Aunt Nomsa in her good church hat fanning herself with a paper program, a few old friends from university, 6 of my longest-serving staff laughing together near the drinks table, running circles around all of it in a yellow sundress with scuffed white sneakers was Amahle, my granddaughter, 9 years old, clutching a bouquet of paper flowers she'd made herself the night before at my kitchen table. I noticed, without really registering it at the time, that Bongani Sitole, my lawyer of 8 years, was seated closer to Kabelo's end of the table than usual. The two of them leaning in every so often, heads bent together over something on a phone. I thought it was odd just for a second before Aunt Nomsa said something that made me laugh, and the thought slipped away. I would not think of it again until much later, and by then, it would mean something very different. Kabelo was 22, broad-shouldered, dressed the way he always dressed lately, a fitted polo, a watch too large and too new, white sneakers so clean they looked untouched by ground. That's the exact backyard, the exact afternoon, when he rose to his feet, tapped that glass, and said the words that already reached you a moment ago. If you think this is where the story ends, you are wrong. This was only the first door opening onto a house full of them, and I promise you the next room was far worse than a phone call from the police. I did not go home that night. I drove to Delta Park instead, an old habit from years ago when Kabelo was small and I needed 10 quiet minutes between school pickup and the evening rush. I parked under a row of eucalyptus trees and sat there in the settling dark, listening to my own heartbeat slow down one breath at a time. The officer on the phone had been polite, almost apologetic. He explained that a call had come in reporting a vehicle taken without permission, that the reporting party was a Mr. Kabelo Mokwena, and that they simply needed to confirm ownership before proceeding. I gave him the registration, my ID number, and told him in a voice steadier than I felt that the car was mine, insured by me, bought outright by me 2 years prior. A pause. Then quietly, almost as if he didn't want colleagues to hear him say it, "Ma'am, I'm very sorry for the disturbance. There won't be any further action." A beat. For what it's worth, that's a hard thing what happened to you today. I thanked him and hung up. That was when the messages started arriving, one after another. "Bring the car back or I'm calling the cops. You're making this worse. Final warning." I read each one twice. I answered none of them. Instead, I opened the Isisekelo Events banking portal on my phone. I want to be honest about something here because it matters. I was not in the habit of combing through line item transaction history. My bookkeeper prepared monthly summary reports for me, totals, categories, a clean picture I signed off on in 5 minutes over coffee. What I did that night for the first time was something else entirely. I opened the raw ledger itself and started scrolling backward, one transaction at a time. 14 months of history, and there it was sitting in the ledger as plainly as a signature. Every month on the third, a payment left the company account and landed in the books as a rental payment for a luxury apartment in Santon. The lease was under Cabello's name. I sat with that for a long moment, the cursor blinking, the eucalyptus trees swaying faintly outside the windshield. 14 months. Hidden under a heading vague enough that no summary report would have ever flagged it. That was the part that frightened me most. Not that the money was gone, but how easily it had hidden. I thought about the 6 years before that. I remembered selling my wedding bangles one at a time to cover private school fees the year the business nearly folded. I remembered pawning my late grandmother's earrings for a car so he could get to campus on time. I remembered nights in the storeroom eating dry bread with soy sauce, telling myself the catering budget mattered more than my own dinner. Not once had I imagined that money was being quietly funneled out from underneath me for a son who only hours ago had told a backyard full of guests he wished I had never existed. I scrolled further, my thumb slower, now almost reluctant. A second line item, smaller, easy to miss. A recurring monthly transfer of 4,500 Rand labeled simply consulting fee. The recipient's name stopped my breath entirely. Bongani Satole, my lawyer, my friend, or at least the man I had called my friend for 8 years. I checked the date the payments began. My chest went tight. It lined up almost to the week with a Sunday lunch nearly 2 years earlier, Cabello asking me casually how a person might go about protecting family assets in case something unexpected ever happened to me. I had never signed a consulting agreement with Bongani. No contract on file, no scope of work, just a number leaving my account every month and landing quietly in his. I would later understand that the money itself was never really the point for Bongani. 8 years of quiet loyalty don't get sold off for 4,000 Rand a month. They get sold off for a promise. Somewhere in those 2 years, Cabello must have offered him something bigger waiting on the other side. A title, a partnership, a future. Bongani's fear wasn't poverty, it was irrelevance. The terror of a man in his late 40s watching a younger generation take over and deciding it was safer to bet on the son than stay loyal to the mother. I sat in the dark for a long time. It wasn't rage I felt first, it was something colder and slower, the specific ache of realizing you've been bleeding for a long time without ever feeling the cut. This is the kind of drama family members build in silence, one small betrayal at a time, until the woman at the center of it is the very last to know. I locked my phone. I sat in the silence of the car park, eucalyptus leaves ticking softly against the windshield, and one question settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. How long had they been preparing this? Not months, not since this afternoon. How long, I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew with a certainty that felt almost peaceful in its clarity that I was no longer going to be the last one in the family to find out. Here's where I want to hear from you before we go any further. If the son who guilt-tripped you into paying his rent for over a year is person A, and the lawyer who took your money in secret for 2 years is person B who betrayed her worse, drop a single letter in the comments, A or B. I'll read every one of them. 2 days passed before Cabello showed up at my front door in Midrand, and he did not come alone. I heard the car before I saw it, Lorato's hatchback gravel crunching too fast, the engine cutting off with a jolt. Cabello was out of the passenger door before the car had fully stopped, his face already tight with anger. The afternoon light was flat and white, the kind that makes every shadow look harder than it should, and somewhere behind him, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then gave up. You made me look like a criminal in front of the police. Bring the car back. Now. I didn't raise my voice to match his. I noticed in the half second before he spoke again that his hands weren't still. His thumb kept moving against the side of his phone case, an old habit from childhood I hadn't seen in years, the same restless tick he'd had before every school exam he wasn't ready for. It struck me standing there that some part of him already knew he was standing on ground that wasn't his. I stepped back from the doorway and let him and Lorado follow me inside, then walked to my home office and returned with a manila folder I'd prepared the night before because some part of me had known this conversation was coming. I laid the documents down one by one, the paper making a small, deliberate sound against the wooden table, the only sound in the room, besides the ceiling fan turning slow overhead. The original vehicle registration, the insurance policy, the purchase invoice paid in full. Every one bore the same name, Tandeka Moquina. Cabello went through them like a man checking a lottery ticket he already suspected had lost. His jaw worked once, twice, but no words came. Lorado stood a step behind him, very still, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her face gone pale, her eyes moving between the papers and my face like she was recalculating something she'd believed for a long time. I did not gloat. I let the paperwork speak for itself the way it had spoken for itself for 6 years without anyone thinking to ask. That night, Lorado came back alone, the porch light catching the puffiness under her eyes, before she'd even said a word. No makeup, eyes red-rimmed. She stood on the step for a moment without coming in, one hand still gripping the strap of her bag like she hadn't fully decided to stay. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice thinner than usual. "I should have shown you a long time ago." She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I noticed her leg bouncing under it, a small nervous rhythm she didn't seem aware of. She handed me her phone and pressed play, a recording 4 minutes long. Cabello's voice relaxed, clearly unaware he was being recorded, talking to a friend I didn't recognize. "She's getting old, man. Sooner or later, she's gonna have to leave it all behind anyway. We just gotta wait it out." I listened to the whole 4 minutes without moving. My son's voice describing his own mother as an obstacle with an expiration date, something to be waited out like weather. I sat with it. I let it settle before I asked her anything further. Lorado watched me for a moment, and something in my quiet seemed to give her courage because she hesitated, then opened something else and turned the phone toward me a second time. A WhatsApp conversation 7 months old. "Cabello babe, try to find where Ma keeps the will, just in case." Her reply from 7 months ago had been a single laughing emoji. "I kept it," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes, "because I started getting scared of the person I was falling for. I told myself for months it didn't mean anything. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. Not that I found it, but how long I sat on it." Lorato's fear wasn't really about me. It was about her own future. She had spent 2 years attaching herself to a man who treated entitlement like a personality. And somewhere in that recording, she heard her own fate laid out plainly. A life spent waiting for someone else to inherit something instead of building anything of her own. Handing me that phone wasn't loyalty to me. It was the first honest act of self-preservation she'd allowed herself in a long time. And I understood that even a small, self-interested truth can still be the truth. I did not explode. I sat with the phone in my hand, the silence in my kitchen stretching long and heavy, the tap dripping once, twice, somewhere behind me. My mind slipped backward uninvited to my grandmother's funeral 5 years earlier in Soweto, when my older sister had leaned toward a cousin and said, "Not quite quiet enough. Tandeka only ever knew how to cook. Lucky Cabello has real ambition." I remembered smiling through it. I remembered serving plates of food to everyone at that funeral, including her without a word in my own defense. I had spent so many years accepting a smaller version of myself that other people handed me simply because arguing felt like more trouble than it was worth. Sitting in my kitchen now, holding proof that the smallness had never been true, it had only ever been convenient for everyone else. Something in me shifted quietly and permanently, like a key finally turning in a lock rusted shut for years. The next morning, I called Bongani Satoli myself. I sat by the kitchen window for a moment before I dialed, watching the light move slowly across the counter, reminding myself that this was a man who had stood beside me at my grandmother's funeral, who had drafted the papers for my very first office lease when I was too nervous to read the fine print myself, who had once driven 2 hours in the rain because I'd called him in a panic over a supplier contract. 8 years is not a small thing to lose in a single phone call. I knew that going in, and I dialed anyway. His voice had a stiffness the moment he heard my name, a formality that hadn't been there in 8 years of friendship. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. How long have you been advising my son about transferring ownership of my assets? 4 full seconds of silence. I counted them. 2 years, he said finally flat, almost relieved to say it out loud after carrying it quietly for so long. It was only later, piecing things together through my new lawyer, that I understood why a man I trusted for 8 years would risk it all for a few thousand rand a month. The consulting fee was never the point. It was a retainer, a way of keeping him loyal and available while Cabello had quietly promised him something much larger, the position of general counsel and a stake in the company the day he took it over. I thanked Bongani for his honesty and ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table in the morning light for a long while afterward, not moving, letting the kettle boil over unnoticed until it clicked itself off. It wasn't relief I felt. It was the strange, hollow quiet of a question finally answered, the kind that leaves you steadier even when the answer is worse than you feared. I understood fully that this had never been a single afternoon of cruelty at a party. It had been a plan built patiently over years by people I had trusted with my heart, my business, and my future. The quiet architecture of a drama family members build without ever admitting they're building it. If you think the betrayal ends with a lawyer and a recording, you have not yet heard what was waiting for me at my own company, because the people closest to Cabello weren't the only ones who had been watching. I did not return to Bongani's office for anything further. I found a new lawyer, a woman named Precious Lamini, who worked out of a small converted house in Ravonia with a single palm tree in a clay pot by the entrance, and a receptionist who remembered my coffee order by the second visit. Her office smelled of paper and rooibos tea, and the first time I sat across from her desk, she didn't ask me what I wanted to do. She asked me what I was afraid of losing next. Nobody had asked me that question in 6 years. I sat there longer than I meant to before I could answer her. Over the following weeks, I sat across from that desk more times than I could count. The changes I made were not born from anger. Anger fades. These decisions were built to last longer than any single feeling. I thought more than once about the card table and the borrowed tent I had started with 17 years earlier. How I used to load hired chairs into the back of a bakkie I didn't own. How I used to negotiate discounts on flowers by promising to recommend the florist to everyone I met. I had built something out of almost nothing, and somewhere in the last 6 years I had let myself forget that the something belonged to me, and to no one else, least of all a son who had never once asked how any of it was built. I restructured EC Secolo Events into a shared ownership model for the staff who had built it beside me from the beginning. When I told Zanelle, my events coordinator of 11 years, what I was planning, she went quiet for a long moment, her pen frozen over her notebook, then said only, "Ma'am, I have to sit down," and did right there on an upturned crate in the storeroom, laughing and wiping her eyes at the same time. These were the same 6 people who had sat quietly at the drinks table at my own Mother's Day party, watching everything unfold, saying nothing because it wasn't their place to. The house in Midran took longer to decide than anything else. I remember standing alone in the hallway one evening before I signed the final paperwork, running my hand along the doorframe where I'd once marked Cabello's height every year until he turned 13 and refused to keep doing it. There was a storage room off the garage I hadn't opened in years, boxes stacked to the ceiling, my grandmother's old sewing machine still under a sheet in the corner. I didn't go through them that night. I only stood there a moment, my palm flat against a box I couldn't even remember the contents of, and thought, whatever is in here belonged to a version of this family that still made sense. Then I closed the door and went back to bed. I revealed to no one but Precious that I had quietly transferred the house's ownership 3 years earlier into a community trust called the Black Mothers Foundation, which supports women rebuilding their lives after financial abuse within their own families. I had structured the transfer with a lifetime right of occupancy for myself, the way many people quietly protect a family home while still living in it, which is exactly why nothing about our daily life there had ever changed, and why no one had any reason to go looking at a deed. Half an hour before the staff meeting where I planned to announce the restructuring, Sizwe Kumalo knocked on my office door. He'd worked for me 9 years by then, ever since I hired him off a stack of application forms when he was 20 and unemployed and too proud to say so outright. I remembered he'd worn a borrowed jacket to the interview 2 sizes too big and answered every question like he expected me to say no. I never forgot that. I don't think he ever forgot that I didn't. He set his laptop down on my desk without much preamble, the screen throwing a cold blue light across the paperwork I'd been reviewing. Outside, the fluorescents in the hallway buzzed faintly, the same tired hum they'd had since we moved into that building. He turned the screen toward me. Access logs, time-stamped entries, Cabello's name recurring at hours no manager had any reason to be online. 11:47 p.m. 1:03 a.m. Always a Tuesday or a Thursday. Always the payroll and inventory systems, never anything else. I flagged it 3 weeks ago, Sizwe said, his voice low, careful, like a man handing over something that might cut him too. I didn't know what to do with it until now. I looked at the screen for a long time. I didn't ask him why he waited. I understood exactly why, because saying it out loud to me meant saying out loud that my own son had been treating my company like something to quietly drain, the way water finds every crack in a foundation before anyone notices the house is sinking. The meeting itself took place at the warehouse on Rivonia Road, the air thick with the smell of cardboard and diesel from the delivery vans idling in the yard outside. I stood in front of the staff and explained the restructuring in plain terms, what percentage, what it meant for each of them, what it would mean going forward. A long silence followed. Zanele looked at the floor. One of the younger drivers, a boy who'd only been with us 8 months, looked at me like he was waiting for the part where I took it back. Then Sizwe stood first and began to clap, slow at first, deliberate, and one by one the others followed until the sound filled the warehouse and bounced off the corrugated roof above us, and for 1 full minute I let myself simply stand there and receive something I had spent 17 years without applause, that asked for nothing in return. That was the exact moment the door slammed open, the sound cracking against the sheet metal walls like something breaking. Cabello stormed in his shoes, slapping hard against the concrete floor, demanding an explanation before he'd even reached us. Amafle ran in behind him in the same yellow sundress she'd worn to my Mother's Day party months earlier, not understanding any of it, only saying, in the small, honest voice of a 9-year-old, breathless from running to keep up with her father, "Daddy said Grandma was only holding the money for him." The warehouse went completely still. Somewhere behind me, one of the vans outside cut its engine, and even that small mechanical silence seemed to lean in and listen. Cabello's face drained of color. His mouth opened once, then closed. I did not say anything further. I only looked at my son and gave one small, slow nod, not anger, just confirmation, as if to say, thank you for finally saying out loud in front of witnesses what I already knew. I turned and walked toward my car. Behind me, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I heard my son call my name. Not with demand this time, but with something that sounded, for just a moment, like real desperation. I kept walking. My hand found the car door handle before my mind had even decided to let it. I did not turn around, though some old tired part of me, the part that had carried him on my back at 7 years old, wanted just for a second to. If you think losing the business fight was the end of what Cabello was willing to do, you are wrong. Because when he realized he couldn't win by taking things from me, he decided to try taking something far more personal instead, my name. After the warehouse, Cabello didn't come to my door again. He went around me instead. That first week, Aunt Nomsa called me every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, the way she'd done since I was a girl and couldn't sleep after my father died. She never asked me if I was all right. She asked me if I'd eaten, and then she'd stay on the line while I made tea, saying nothing in particular, just letting me hear her television murmuring in the background from her flat in Soweto, so I wouldn't have to sit in silence. "You don't owe him your softness anymore," she told me once, so quietly I almost missed it. "You already gave him 17 years of it." I didn't answer her. I only held the phone a little tighter. Over the following 2 weeks, calls started reaching relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. People suddenly full of opinions about my state of mind. My cousin Toomey called first, her voice bright and careful in the way people sound when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. "We just want to make sure you're okay, Tandeka. Cabello said you've been different lately." I asked her evenly, different from what? She didn't have an answer. She only repeated that people were worried, and I understood, listening to the practiced concern in her voice, that Cabello had chosen his words for her carefully, the same way he'd once chosen the words he said at my own party. The story making its way through those calls was a careful one, that I was unstable since my divorce, that I was sabotaging the company out of jealousy over my own son's success, a success I noted quietly built largely out of my own bank account without my knowledge. The damage reached further than family gossip. One of our largest corporate clients, a relationship I had built over 4 careful years, called to cancel a contract worth nearly R500,000, citing vague concerns about leadership that had clearly been planted in a single phone call. I read the cancellation email alone in my office that evening, the building emptied out around me. The desk lamp, the only light left on the floor. Rain had started against the window sometime while I wasn't paying attention. A thin, steady sound against the glass. And somewhere down the corridor, a cleaner's cart squeaked past and then went quiet. I remembered the first meeting with that client 4 years earlier in a boardroom on the 17th floor. How nervous I'd been walking in with nothing but a portfolio and a proposal I'd rewritten 6 times the night before. I had built that relationship one flawless event at a time, one apology for a small mistake, one free upgrade when a delivery ran late. None of that history mattered now against a single planted phone call. I felt something I hadn't expected. Cold. Not angry cold, the specific chill of understanding exactly what my son was reaching for now. He no longer wanted the money, or the car, or the house. He wanted people to look at me and see a woman who had lost control of herself. My phone rang. Seasway, his voice low and steady, the most reliable sound in my life these past weeks. 3 weeks ago, I locked Cabello out of all internal systems, he said. I did it before you decided anything. I saw him in the payroll records at midnight, and I wasn't going to wait for permission. He paused, and I heard him exhale like he'd been carrying the confession a long time. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to be the one who put it in your head first." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said only, "Thank you. From now on, treat him like any other applicant." After I hung up, I sat alone at my desk for a long while, the rain still ticking against the glass, and I let myself do something I hadn't allowed since the day of the party. I put my head down against my folded arms and cried quietly for exactly as long as it took the office building's motion sensor lights to click off around me. Not the crying of a woman falling apart, the other kind, the kind that empties something out so there's room left for whatever comes next. When it passed, I sat up, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and turned the desk lamp off myself. I did not post anything online defending myself. I did not explain myself to relatives who had already made up their minds. I did not call the client back to beg. I simply kept working, letting the silence around me speak louder than anything I could have said. Within weeks, the structure Cabello had built around himself began to come apart on its own, the way loud, hollow things tend to when nothing is actually holding them up. Lorato left him quietly, without any scene of her own. She simply stopped answering when relatives called looking for gossip and stopped coming by the house altogether. I heard much later that she'd gone back to finish a diploma she'd paused 2 years earlier for the relationship. I hoped for her sake that she finished it. A few relatives who had repeated Cabello's version of events stopped calling too, whether from guilt or embarrassment, I never asked. One afternoon, Amahle called me from Lorato's phone, her voice small and matter-of-fact, the way children's voices are when they don't yet understand the weight of what they're saying. "Daddy's been going through boxes in the garage at the old house," she told me. "He said he's looking for something of yours." I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed he was searching for some document he thought might still favor him. I told her to tell him the boxes weren't his to go through and left it there. 3 months later, an application appeared in the Isisekelo hiring system under the name Cabello Mukwena. Not for a management role, not for anything close to what he'd once assumed would be his. An entry-level position in warehouse logistics. The manager assigned to review it by the ordinary rotation of our hiring process was Sizwe Kumalo. Sizwe called to ask if I had any objection. I told him none at all, as long as he was treated exactly like every other name on that list, no more and no less. Sizwe hired him 2 weeks later at the bottom on the same terms as anyone else walking in off the street. If you think that was the last surprising twist in this family drama, wait until you hear what happened exactly 1 year later, on the very same day it all began. Because the final twist wasn't about money or business at all. Cabello worked at that warehouse for 11 months before I ever spoke to him again outside of a hiring form. Sizwe told me, only in passing, one small story that stayed with me longer than he probably meant it to. Early on, a delivery had gone wrong. A wedding order, 40 centerpieces loaded onto the wrong van by a junior picker's mistake. And by the time anyone noticed, the correct event was 3 hours away and the correct van was already on the road to a different site. Cabello was the one who caught it. He didn't call anyone to fix it for him. He loaded a company bakkie himself, drove it across 2 suburbs in Friday traffic, and personally carried the centerpieces in through the venue's kitchen entrance so the bride would never know anything had gone wrong at all. He never mentioned it to me. Sizwe only found out because the venue manager called to compliment the young man who saved the day. He started at the bottom, the way everyone does, loading trucks before sunrise, running inventory counts, taking instructions from people who used to work for him in his own imagination and never once in reality. Sizwe told me only in passing that he showed up on time, that he didn't complain, that he was quiet in a way none of us had ever seen from him before. I didn't ask for more than that. A year of ordinary, unglamorous work does something to a person that no apology ever could. Mother's Day came around again. Quieter this time. No rented chairs, no chafing dishes, no arch of white and gold flowers, just a small table in my own backyard, a simple lunch I'd cooked myself, and Amahle running through the sprinklers, shrieking with laughter every time the water caught her by surprise, her wet footprints darkening the paving stones, one after another, like a trail someone might follow home. A car pulled up outside the gate. An older Toyota, clean but modest. the engine idling a beat too long before it finally cut off, like the driver was still deciding whether to come in at all. I heard the gate latch before I saw him. Amale stopped mid-shriek, sprinkler water still arcing behind her, and went very still, the way she had at the party a year before. Cabello stepped out. He'd lost weight. Plain gray shirt sleeves pushed up past his elbows, no watch at all where the oversized one used to sit. Something in the way he walked toward me had changed. Slower, less certain of his welcome, the way a person walks when they finally learn that entry isn't owed to them. He stopped a full 3 meters short of the table, close enough to speak, far enough to show me he wasn't assuming anything. Amath looked between the two of us, unsure whether to run to him or stay where she was. I gave her a small nod and she went, hugging his legs the way children do, without any of the complicated history adults carry, and for a moment his hand rested on her wet hair, and something in his face nearly broke before he caught it. He held out a small photo frame without a word at first, his hand not quite steady. Inside was an old picture, me, years younger, carrying him on my back at 7 years old. The two of us on our way to deliver a catering order on my old motorbike before I'd been able to afford a car. I found it in one of the old storage boxes at the house, he said quietly, his voice catching once on storage, like the word itself cost him something. I'm not asking for anything back. I just wanted you to know I've been learning. I took the frame from his hands, my fingers brushing his for the first time in nearly a year, and I understood something in that moment that he clearly did not, because I recognized this exact frame. 12 years ago, I had tucked a small folded note behind that very photograph before packing it away in storage, never once expecting to see it again, let alone from his own hands. I opened the back. The paper was still there, yellowed at the edges, exactly where I had left it, folded into a small square, gone soft at the creases from 12 years in the dark. I read it aloud, my voice barely above a whisper, and I heard it shake once, right in the middle before I steadied it. When I grow up, I'll buy Ma a big house so she never has to work again. I promise. Cabello, age 10. The silence that followed was long enough that I could hear only Amahle's laughter drifting in from the yard, and somewhere beyond the fence, a neighbor's radio playing something soft and tinny, and the sprinkler still hissing faithfully back and forth across the grass, unaware that anything in the world had just changed. In that silence, I understood both of us fully for the first time. Cabello hadn't come back to manipulate me. The boy who wrote that note was still in there somewhere, and some part of him had unknowingly handed me the very proof of who he used to be before entitlement replaced tenderness. His deepest fear was never losing money. It was becoming ordinary, becoming forgettable, becoming a son no one was proud of. And my own conflict was just as real, loving him completely, while refusing finally to let that love cost me my own dignity ever again. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I set the empty frame down on the table between us. I looked my son in the eyes. You had the blueprint since you were 10 years old, I said. You just chose to build against it for 12 years. The door is still open. But the house you promised me, it isn't mine to give away anymore. It belongs to the women who stayed. He nodded once, slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he'd already expected. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for more time. He only said, "Okay, Ma," in a voice so much smaller than the one that had once stood up at a party and humiliated me in front of 35 guests, and for a moment I let myself grieve quietly for both versions of him at once, the boy who wrote that note and the man who'd nearly buried him for good. I turned. I walked into the house first. I did not look back, and I did not close the door behind me. Later that evening, after Cabello had gone and the yard had gone quiet, Amatle climbed up onto the kitchen counter stool beside me while I washed the last of the dishes, her hair still damp from the sprinkler, smelling of chlorine and cut grass. "Are you and Daddy okay now?" she asked in the plain, direct way only children ask the questions adults spend years avoiding. I dried my hands slowly before I answered her. We're going to be okay in our own way in our own time, I told her. That doesn't always look the same as before. Sometimes it looks better. She considered that with the seriousness only a 9-year-old can bring to a kitchen counter, then held up her small paper flower bouquet from the fridge, the same kind she'd made a year earlier, now slightly faded, and said, I made a new one. Yellow this time. Yellow's happier than white. I told her she was right, and I meant it more than she knew. I stood in my kitchen afterward, both hands pressed flat against the counter, breathing slowly. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel like a woman abandoning her child. I felt like a woman who had finally chosen to stand on the side of herself. And if there's one thing this whole drama family journey taught me, it's that peace rarely comes with an apology attached. Sometimes it just comes with quiet. This story reminds us that dignity isn't something you get back all at once. You get it back one small decision at a time. If you're a woman who spent decades giving more than you kept, here's something practical, not poetic. Open one bank account this week that only you can access, and don't tell anyone the password, not even the children you trust most. Call one old friend you've let go quiet on you, not to vent, just to laugh about something small. If you're recently widowed, write down on actual paper what you want for yourself next year, even one line, and put it where you'll see it every morning. Join something with a weekly meeting time, a church group, a walking club, a card table at the community center, because routine outside the family is what keeps you from disappearing inside it. And if someone you love makes you feel small at your own table, you're allowed to simply stand up and leave the room. You don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing your own peace at any age over anyone else's comfort.